It was widely agreed in the village of Gallows Cross, by those whose opinion was offered gratis and often unsolicited, that it was a dreadful business altogether, though opinions diverged wildly as to why it was so dreadful. Mrs. Sturgis at the post office declared it a tragedy of declining standards in property management. Reverend Bagworthy muttered something vague about the decay of spiritual values since the war, and Colonel Pentreath, who had been retired for at least 3 wars, said it was what one might expect when land passed too quickly between hands that had no ancestral dirt beneath their fingernails. Indeed, Crowthorne Hall had changed owners 3 times in as many years. That in itself was enough to raise eyebrows in a part of Dorset where land ownership was regarded with almost sacramental solemnity. But when the latest master of the hall, Mr. Roderick Hargrave, a nervous man with a tendency to blink rapidly in conversation and an interest in antique plumbing, was found hanging by his own cravat from the ironwork stair rail of the East Tower Library, the villagers' eyebrows practically flew off their foreheads. "It's a very modern kind of hanging," said Lord Peter Wimsey thoughtfully, peering at the unfortunate tableau before him. "Almost chic. If he had been wearing a spats and boater ensemble, I dare say it might even have made the cover of La Gazette du Crime. What do you say, Parker?" Detective Inspector Charles Parker, long accustomed to his brother-in-law's blend of archness and acumen, made a small noise that could have meant agreement or indigestion. "Bit elaborate, don't you think? Most suicides don't bother with antique stair rails and decorative knots." "True," murmured Wimsey, crouching gracefully beside the body and studying the looped silk of the cravat. Not exactly the sort of finish one expects from a man last seen asking about whether the vicarage garden might be suitable for installing a fish pond. "The fellow doesn't strike one as a Hamlet, does he?" Parker, consulting his notes, replied dryly, "He was known to be anxious lately. Business troubles, a bit of whispering about debts, and he apparently quarrelled with the estate's previous owner just last week. An old solicitor named Bloodstone. Sold him the place. Didn't like the renovations. Good heavens, Bloodstone. The crusty old fellow who lectures about ancient property law to Rotary clubs and was once barred from the Athenaeum for quoting Blackstone at luncheon. The same. Lives just across the lane in the Dower House. Still thinks Crowthorne should have stayed in his family's hands. He inherited it from a cousin and sold it to pay off—" Parker paused delicately. "Some obligations." "Obligations, eh?" Wimsey's eyes twinkled. "A euphemism as lovely as any that ever obscured a scandal. Do you know, Charles, I begin to think this estate has acquired a certain unhealthy eagerness to be rid of its owners." Parker glanced up from his notepad. "How do you mean?" "Well, the previous fellow, one of those nouveau riche biscuit magnates from Birmingham, sold up after just 6 months, having taken violently to theosophy and vegetable juicing. And before him, there was that Canadian industrialist whose wife allegedly ran off with a spiritual medium after hearing voices in the drawing-room chimney. And now poor Hargrave. 3 owners, 3 exits of a particularly dramatic kind." Parker gave a skeptical grunt. "And what do you infer from that, Peter?" "Oh, nothing supernatural, of course," Wimsey said airily. "Just that the house appears to possess a certain theatrical sensibility. But come, what else do we know of the dear departed? Lived here just under 5 months. Bought it at a sharp discount from Bloodstone. No known relatives. 1 manservant, Bates, formerly of the Royal Artillery, now tending roses and offering disapproving coughs at breakfast. And there's a Miss Seven, housekeeper of sorts, though she seemed more companion than domestic. Rather odd bird. Lost a fiancé in the last war, never quite the same afterwards. Bookish. Isn't everyone?" said Wimsey cheerfully. "And how was he found?" "By the gardener, Wells, 6 a.m. on his way to open the glass-house. Thought it odd the front door was ajar. Came in and saw Hargrave dangling like a puppet. Didn't touch anything," called the constable. "And nobody heard a thing during the night? No screams, banging, suspicious wailing of ghosts or banshees?" "Not a peep. Miss Seven says she went to bed with a book, Lives of the Saints, apparently, and heard nothing till the morning. Bates says the same, minus the hagiography." Wimsey's gaze wandered toward the high-arched window. Rain smeared the leaded panes with dull streaks of light. "Do we know if the door was locked before the event?" "Miss Seven swears she locked it at 11. Bates says he was reading the Times by the kitchen stove till about past. No visitors expected. No signs of forced entry." Wimsey drew a gloved finger down the mahogany banister. "And yet one cannot help thinking—" He paused, inspecting a fine trace of dust. "That this stair rail hasn't been polished in at least a week. And yet look here, where the rope coiled. Wiped clean. Our murderer tidies up after himself. Considerate chap." Parker joined him with a frown. "You're suggesting it's not suicide?" "I'm suggesting," said Whimsy, straightening, "that a man prone to anxious muttering about cistern valves and overdrafts does not ordinarily select a spot of architectural drama for his exit. Particularly not in a room whose window, I notice, gives a rather splendid view of the old family graves. Too picturesque." He glanced again at the body, as though expecting it to make a final contribution to the discussion. Then he added more softly, "And do look at the knot. That's not a man tying his own doom. It's a stagehand preparing a finale. I'd wager half a crown our Mr. Hargrave had help leaving this mortal coil." Parker closed his notebook with a sigh. "So you'll be staying then?" "Dear fellow," said Lord Peter with a grin, "you know perfectly well I can't resist a property with a murderous turnover rate and a view of ancestral graves. Send for Bunter, would you? And perhaps a decent bottle of Burgundy. I suspect this investigation will go rather better with both." And with that, he turned on his heel, whistling something that sounded suspiciously like a hunting we will go, and disappeared into the corridor of Crowthorne Hall, where secrets gathered like dust on the tapestries and nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever quite what it appeared. Lord Peter Whimsy had always held a particular fondness for interviewing domestics, not merely for the subtle charms of navigating propriety and veiled condescension, but because he firmly believed that a household staff, much like the mechanism of a watch, gave away its secrets only to those who knew where to press. At Crowthorne Hall, however, he sensed something less precise than machinery, and rather more like the creaking of inherited discomfort. He began with Bates, the manservant, summoned to the library where Hargrave had last hung, not merely in social station, but regrettably also in person. The constable had seen to the removal of the body earlier that morning, but a ghostly sense of suspended judgment still lingered in the high-vaulted room. Bates stood stiffly near the hearth, hands folded like church linen, his moustache clipped to military neatness. He had a face one might have carved from grim approval. "Now then, Mr. Bates," said Whimsy, settling into a chair like a man preparing to enjoy a matinee. "You've been with Mr. Hargrave since he acquired the property?" "Correct, my lord. I was retained by him upon the purchase of the estate. Prior to that I served Mr. Blodstone for a number of years." "Ah, so you've had the opportunity to observe Crowthorne's curious game of musical chairs. Tell me, was Mr. Hargrave in the habit of entertaining guests?" "No, my lord. Very quiet gentleman, solitary habits, tended to his books, spoke often to Miss Severn, took his meals regular, drank only a small glass of port at supper. That sort. And the atmosphere of the house? Tense, unsettled?" Bates paused. "Sir, I do not as a rule speculate on the emotional resonance of properties. I perform my duties." "Of course you do," said Whimsy lightly. "But indulge me. Mr. Hargrave, was he frightened?" The hesitation was telling. Bates's mouth grew firmer. "I wouldn't call it fear, sir. He was preoccupied. Spoke sometimes of being watched, but only when particularly tired. Thought he heard footsteps once or twice at night. I suggested it was the plumbing. It's Victorian, you know. Plumbing," mused Whimsy. "The root of all spectral mischief. Now, your own whereabouts last evening?" "I had finished my duties by 10 o'clock. Read the Times until about 11. Retired to my quarters. I sleep in the west wing, far side of the servants' corridor. I heard nothing unusual. No sounds, raised voices, or sudden crashes from the library." "No, my lord. Absolute quiet." "Did he seem different yesterday?" "Agitated. He received a letter. I didn't see the contents. After that, he took a walk round the grounds and came in with wet boots. I cleaned them. Did he often receive post?" "Not much. Bills, a few catalogues. This one came by hand." "By hand?" Whimsy's tone sharpened slightly. "You saw the messenger?" "No, my lord. The envelope was found by the kitchen door. No stamp. Mr. Hargrave picked it up himself." "Interesting. And what of Miss Severn?" "Still in her room, sir." Whimsy rose. Let's remedy that. Miss Eugenia Severn occupied the south-facing guest room, which she had inhabited since moving into the hall with Mr. Hargrave. Her appearance matched Bates's vague classification of bookish, thin, angular, greying at the temples and dressed in what might once have been a smart navy suit, now softened with frequent brushing. "Lord Peter," she said in a tone too flat for curiosity, "I gather you wish to speak with me, if you can spare a moment. I understand you and Mr. Hargrave were acquainted. We met during a symposium on ecclesiastical architecture. He invited me to advise on the restoration of the chapel in the north wing. I remained on as a sort of general companion. Had he many other companions? None that I know of. He had an aversion to society, rather a tendency to melancholia, if you understand me." Whimsy gave a faint smile. "Oh, indeed. I breakfasted with Tennyson once, and came away permanently allergic to gloomy men with long hair. Did Mr. Hargrave speak of unhappiness, or discontent with the estate?" She gave a measured shake of the head. "Not unhappiness, but he was unsettled. He had the sense of inheriting something that did not wish to be inherited. That's a curious phrase. Did he say it? Something like it. He said Crowthorne felt resistant. I don't believe in such things, of course. He was sensitive, susceptible. And last night, I read until late. I have trouble sleeping. I heard nothing unusual. No footsteps, no raised voices." She paused. "No, but I did hear a door close softly around midnight." Whimsy leaned forward. "Which door?" "I couldn't say. The sound came from the corridor, perhaps the library. I remember thinking it was odd, but I was half asleep." "You didn't investigate?" "No." Whimsy studied her. "Did Mr. Hargrave quarrel with anyone recently?" She hesitated. "Yes, Mr. Blodstone. He came 3 days ago. They argued about the condition of the estate. Something to do with the ownership of a piece of woodland near the boundary. Anything serious?" "I thought not." But Roderick was shaken. "Blodstone threatened legal action. He left in a temper." Whimsy sat back. "And now your employer is dead. Tell me, was there ever affection between you?" She met his gaze steadily. "Once, perhaps, but not recently. He was too immersed in his ghosts." "Ghosts?" She glanced toward the window. "Not spirits, memories. He felt this house had them. I believe he was quite wrong. Quite wrong or dangerously right?" She said nothing. Outside, the rain had turned to a thin mist that crept along the hedgerows and made the estate look blurred at the edges. Whimsy walked with Parker through the upper corridor, inspecting the angle of the library door, the depth of the rug impressions, and the wax smudge on the brass lock. 2 testimonies, he said, and neither much use. Everyone heard nothing. And yet Miss Seven heard a door close. That's something. It's very little. But it's precisely when it closed that interests me. If Hargrave died before midnight, the door sound implies a second presence. If after, then who shut it and why so gently? Parker frowned. "The letter bothers me, as it should. A letter that arrives by hand, unnerves a man and is gone by morning. I intend to find it. It may have found its way into one of those handy little fire grates the English gentry are so fond of. And if it's ashes, then we shall sift ashes." They paused at the foot of the East Tower stair, where a faint indentation still lingered in the dust-polished wood. Whimsy tapped the balustrade gently. No suicide cleans the surface before stringing himself up. "And only someone familiar with the house would think to tidy the scene," Parker muttered. "Bates? Too obvious. Besides, he'd never permit an improper knot." They walked in silence until Whimsy said, as if to himself, 3 owners, 3 exits, and a house with memory. And then, with a sudden shift in tone, "Charles, tomorrow we pay a visit to Mr. Blodstone. I have a particular interest in men who argue about boundaries and leave letters by kitchen doors. Mr. Ezra Blodstone's residence, known with some irony as the Dower House, was a square red-brick monstrosity crouching behind 2 overpruned yews and a set of iron gates whose paint flaked away like a confession. It did not exude welcome, and Lord Peter Whimsy, who had known enough solicitors to differentiate between the amiable and the calcified, stepped through its threshold with the mild air of a man visiting a crypt, charming. But faintly expectant of mould, they were shown by a pale maid with hands like claws and a disposition that suggested the notion of tea would be regarded as an impertinence. Mr. Blodstone himself emerged from a corridor lined with faded legal prints, his appearance bearing a passing resemblance to a vulture that had once read law at Lincoln's Inn. "Lord Peter," he said, as if pronouncing sentence, "and Mr. Parker, I believe. So I'd wondered when you might turn up. You flatter our inevitability, said Whimsy, sinking into a seat whose horsehair stuffing made audible complaint. We do have a rather tiresome habit of calling on anyone who quarrelled with a man just before he was found swinging by the neck. Bloodstone's thin lips pressed together. I trust I'm not to be accused on the basis of having a strong opinion. Not at all, said Parker. We're merely gathering the timeline. We understand you visited Mr. Hargrave 3 days ago? I did. I wanted to discuss a boundary dispute. There's a line of oaks behind the south copse that Hargrave had cleared without consulting the deeds. They form part of an easement that was entailed under the 1874 revision of the estate's charter. I thought he ought to know. I'm sure he was fascinated, said Whimsy lightly. Did the discussion become heated? Bloodstone gave a dry cough. I may have raised my voice. Hargrave had a tendency to assume that money erased obligation. A newer owner every season, each less conversant with civility than the last, and you say every season. So you weren't fond of the previous buyers either. I wasn't fond of any of them, said Bloodstone. The Canadian lumberman installed electric heating in the chapel. The biscuit man wanted to turn the east wing into a garage. Mr. Hargrave at least left the architecture untouched, though he showed little respect for the land. Respect for land, murmured Whimsy. Such a satisfying phrase. Almost biblical. Bloodstone eyed him. You make light of it, but these things matter. The hall was once a centerpiece of the county. There are maps that place it at the spiritual heart of Dorset. Ah, yes, said Whimsy. Nothing quite so eternal as local property rights, Parker interjected. Can you tell us where you were last night? Certainly. Here working. I reviewed 2 title abstracts and wrote up my weekly brief for the Historical Land Register. My maid, Miss Philby, can confirm. And you didn't send any correspondence to Mr. Hargrave yesterday evening? Bloodstone's brow creased. I did not. Why? A letter, unsigned and hand-delivered, was found by his kitchen door. We believe it distressed him. I sent no such letter, Bloodstone said flatly. And if someone did, I suggest you look closer to the hall. Plenty of resentment stirs in that place. Whimsy tilted his head. Resentment? Servants who knew better, masters. A housekeeper too clever by half. Even the village resents the hall's restlessness. You'll find your culprit, Lord Peter, but you won't find him in this house. Whimsy rose. Well, we shall see. But do let us know if you suddenly remember writing an impassioned note after dinner. It can happen. Back in the lane, Parker's expression had settled into thoughtful suspicion. He has the temper for it, he said. Yes, but no motive we've yet unearthed, said Whimsy. He loved the estate in the abstract, loathed the owners in particular. That's not a murderer, Charles, that's a county tradition. And the letter. If he didn't write it, someone meant it to seem like he did. The tone, the timing, the method of delivery, altogether theatrical. Now consider this. Who in the hall would benefit from making Hargrave afraid of Bloodstone? You think it's staged? You think it's staged? Everything about this death reeks of performance. A man unnerved, a silent night, and a dramatically suspended body in the one room with a Gothic tower window. It's less like a suicide than an operatic Act 3. Back at Crowthorne, they paused in the library again. Bunter, having arrived with commendable speed and a suspiciously polished suitcase, was already conducting a quiet inventory of the ash in the hearth. He looked up. Your lordship, there are traces of what appears to be fine rag paper, and wax seal remains among the cinders. No visible writing survived, but the fibers suggest heavy stock. Possibly handmade, clever Bunter. And the seal? Burnt through, but I believe it may have borne the impression of an owl. Whimsy looked sharply at Parker. That's Bloodstone's crest. He uses it on his official papers. Parker swore under his breath. So he did send it. Or someone made it look like he did, said Whimsy. Miss Seven said the letter was found by the door. That's quite public, if you think of it. Anyone could have left it, and anyone could have seen it. They called for Wells, the gardener, who appeared with muddy boots and the anxious air of a man who feared the law's interest might result in the confiscation of his secateurs. I didn't see no letter, my lord, he said. Didn't go near the kitchen, but I saw a figure round back just before dusk yesterday. Thought it might be Miss Seven taking air. Could you see the face? No, my lord. They had a scarf up and a coat. Moved quick. From the copse toward the service door. And the build? Wells scratched his head. Could have been a woman. Could have been a thin man. I'm sorry. "You've been very helpful," said Whimsy, ushering him out. Then to Parker, "The timing's tight. If the letter appeared just before dusk and was burned after supper, Hargrave had less than 6 hours between receiving it and ending up dead." Parker folded his arms. "What do we think now?" Ploddestone wrote a letter in a fit of legal pique. Someone intercepted it, copied the crest, and delivered a forgery. Possible. But I prefer to think the killer wanted Hargrave dead, and the letter was the bait. A psychological prod. What do we know about Hargrave's past? Not much. Inherited money from his father's import firm. Mild depression after an illness 2 years ago. Nothing scandalous. "Then we must look at the house," said Whimsy. 3 owners, 3 exits. Either it's cursed, which I doubt, or someone doesn't want anyone staying in it for long. Someone close, someone constant. Miss Seven, she fits the bill. Long-standing presence, oddly devoted. Bookish, yes, but also precise. People with grief behind their eyes can be dangerous, Charles, particularly if they feel ownership over a place or a person. Parker exhaled slowly. "You're suggesting she forged the letter, or saw it and used it? Both possibilities remain open. And there's one more thing, the window." "The library window?" "Yes. The tower overlooks the chapel yard. A picturesque drop, but it's also visible from the dower house. You think the body was meant to be seen? Not just seen, interpreted, as a message. Perhaps to Bloodstone, perhaps to the village. Something about permanence and ownership." Parker looked skeptical. "That's a lot of symbolism for a killer." "Yes," said Whimsy softly, "but in a house like this, everything means something to someone. It's only a matter of finding out who believed themselves most wronged, and who wished to be seen avenging it." He turned toward the stairs, fingers brushing the polished banister. "Tomorrow we'll examine Hargrave's study and personal papers, and perhaps we'll take a closer look at Miss Seven's reading habits. I'm particularly interested in people who quote the saints, but think like Sophocles." The stair creaked faintly as they ascended, the house settling around them with the weight of unfinished stories and a patience that was, as ever, unnervingly English. By mid-morning the next day, the light had crept reluctantly through the grey skies and filtered into the upper floors of Crowthorne Hall, illuminating its age with a kind of wintry honesty. Whimsy and Parker stood outside the late Mr. Hargrave's private study, a cramped, north-facing room wedged between the East Tower stairwell and a narrow linen closet, and waited for Bunter to finish dusting the doorknob with a tact that only he could lend to forensic delicacy. "There is, I believe, a certain perversity," Whimsy murmured, "in the habit of melancholy men to keep their most private thoughts in the coldest part of the house. One wonders whether it's guilt or simply bad taste in insulation." Parker gave a grunt of non-committal agreement. Bunter stepped back. "No prints of value, my lord. A few smudges, most likely Mr. Hargrave's. The lock appears to have been untouched." Whimsy opened the door with his usual feline grace and stepped into a room that, for all its size, seemed to hoard shadows. The wallpaper had once been green, but now resembled the color of lichen after a frost. A tall escritoire dominated one wall, its drawers pulled closed with military precision, and the fireplace, unused, unlit, harbored a neat stack of correspondence trays and an ink blotter, bearing the imprint of Hargrave's slanted, nervous hand. "Do men still write personal thoughts in journals?" Parker asked, watching as Whimsy opened drawer after drawer. "Only the excessively guilty or the excessively literary," Whimsy replied. "The former burn them before dying. The latter arrange for posthumous publication." The bottom drawer yielded a leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked, its contents organized in a hand meticulous enough to suggest a mind in need of controlling something, if not everything. Whimsy flipped through a series of entries, minor estate expenses, notes on the restoration of the chapel roof, and several clipped newspaper articles, all relating to prior owners of Crowthorne Hall. "Curious," Whimsy murmured. "Here's the biscuit magnate's bankruptcy notice. And, here we have a lurid little piece about the Canadian and his wife's tragic entanglement with a clairvoyant. Our late Mr. Hargrave seems to have been compiling a dossier on the Hall's owners. Look, there's even a note scrawled here. They are all driven out. Why should I stay? Rather dramatic, what?" Parker frowned. "Paranoia? Possibly. But if he truly believed himself next in a cursed sequence, wouldn't he have left, rather than hung himself in theatrical splendor?" There's something too deliberate about that knot, and too symbolic about that view. No, I suspect this journal is not the result of madness, but of preparation. They turned their attention to the smaller drawers. One yielded a roll of sealed correspondence, receipts mostly, while another held a flat brass box containing an odd assortment of calling cards and ribbon-tied letters. Whimsy picked up a card at random and tilted his head. Dr. E. Flinters, Psychical Research Society, Upper Wimpole Street. I say, Parker, our dear Hargrave may have dipped a toe in the ectoplasmic. He never struck me as the seance sort, nor me, which means someone pushed him that way. A man who begins with plumbing catalogues and ends with spirit guides has either seen a ghost or someone has gone to considerable lengths to manufacture one. Parker picked up one of the ribbon-bound letters. These are from Miss Seven. Notes on chapel layouts, hymnals, and, wait, this one's dated 6 months ago, before Hargrave bought the estate. Ah, said Whimsy, his eyes lighting up. So their acquaintance predates his residence here. That contradicts her earlier account, does it not? Parker nodded. She said they met at the symposium after he'd moved in. But this is a letter discussing the condition of the east cloister window prior to purchase. Then she was guiding his interest in the estate from the start. Curious. One might even say, curating it. The study yielded no further revelatory objects, but Whimsy lingered by the window, fingers drumming lightly against the sill. You see the view from here, Charles. Direct line to the chapel roof. The south orchard beyond that. If one wished to signal or observe, Parker joined him. The same view Bloodstone mentioned in his dispute. That row of oaks, just beyond the boundary line. The ones Hargrave cleared, exactly. A man who felt watched, even cursed, would have viewed that clearing not just as landscape management, but as an act of defiance. It's always the oaks, Charles. Symbolism lurks in the strangest foliage. By early afternoon, Whimsy and Parker sat with Miss Seven once more, this time in the parlor, beneath a pair of insipid watercolors, depicting storm-tossed ships and a porcelain clock that ticked with the air of someone watching. "We've found your letters," Whimsy said pleasantly. "And they are most enlightening." Miss Seven looked up slowly. She had changed into a more severe blouse, but the same brooch, a Celtic knot in oxidized silver, remained pinned at her throat. "You went through Mr. Hargrave's effects. He is, alas, in no position to object. You told us your acquaintance with him began after he acquired Crowthorne." "That was inaccurate," she folded her hands. "Yes, I thought it unimportant. He corresponded with many people, few with whom he discussed chapel architecture 6 months before the purchase. I advised him," she said coolly. "He was a lonely man. I gave him something to fixate on. The hall became an idea to him. Something stable, or something haunted." She did not answer. "Miss Seven," said Parker, "did you place a letter by the kitchen door on the evening of Mr. Hargrave's death?" "No." "Did you see who did?" "No, but you were near the corridor. You heard a door close." Her fingers tightened. "I did not say I saw anything. I'm not a liar, Mr. Parker. If I wished to deceive you, I would do so thoroughly." Whimsy smiled faintly. "That at least I believe." There was a silence. Then she said more quietly, "He was frightened. He began to speak of voices, shadows on the stair. Once he said the chapel's foundations were sinking. I told him he was imagining it. He didn't believe me. Did you encourage his interest in the previous owners?" "I discouraged it. It obsessed him. He kept muttering that the hall chose who could stay. That the house didn't like him." Whimsy studied her. "And did you like him?" Another silence. "Then I pitied him. He was like a boy dressing up in his father's suit. No idea what weight he was putting on." "Weight," said Parker. "The weight of the place, of history." When they left her, Whimsy stood in the hall frowning up at a broken cornice above the library arch. "She's hiding something," said Parker. "Oh, undoubtedly. But what intrigues me more is why she led him to the house in the first place. I believe Miss Seven knew Crowthorne's power to unsettle. She fed his obsession. Perhaps to study it. Perhaps to punish. Punish whom? Bloodstone? The Hargraves of the world. Or perhaps herself. People do strange things when they feel the ground beneath them is borrowed." He turned. "There's a missing piece still. Something about the sequence, 3 owners, 3 departures, each pushed. But this one was crafted," Parker said, "the forged letter." "Indeed. And if it was meant to mimic Bloodstone, Perhaps it's time we asked him one more question. About the owl seal, and who else had access to his stationery. You think someone stole it? I think someone used it with purpose, and I'd rather like to know who in this village collects family crests like postage stamps. Parker raised a brow. So we visit the village antiquarian? Precisely, said Whimsy, because if I were constructing a murder, dressed in the robes of tradition, I'd start with someone who knows exactly what robes to borrow. And with that, he reached for his hat as the echoing clock in the parlor struck 4, and the house exhaled something cold into the air behind them. The antiquarian in Gallows Cross, one Mr. Quentin Sprott, occupied the back half of what had once been the village apothecary, a narrow, draughty building with a bow-fronted window, in which antique spoons, foxed maps, and moth-eaten military sashes languished beneath a film of dignified neglect. A placard in the window read Estion 1894, Buyers of Books, Curiosities and Heraldic Devices. Whimsy tapped it lightly with his cane as he entered, remarking, You know, Charles, there's nothing more treacherous than a shop that traffics in both tinctures and family pride. It leads inevitably to poisoners with a sense of lineage. Inside, the smell was a combination of camphor, pipe tobacco, and dry vellum. Mr. Sprott himself emerged from behind a curtain like an actor called for the final act. He was slight and beady-eyed, with the stooped posture of a man whose shoulders had long borne the weight of genealogical significance. Lord Peter Whimsy, he said, bowing with a surprising amount of creaking. It's a pleasure to see a nobleman with an eye for the past. Most of your sort prefer golf. I loathe golf, said Whimsy cheerfully. It seems to me the sort of thing one plays when one's sense of consequence is inadequate to support conversation. We're here on a matter of heraldry, Mr. Sprott, specifically the owl. Sprott's face pinched with interest. The owl. Bloodstone's line, of course. A long and rather tangled tree, prone to falling branches. May I ask the context? A wax seal, burnt but legible, from a letter delivered to Mr. Hargrave of Crowthorne Hall the night before he was found, well, let's say improperly suspended. Sprott sucked his teeth. A nasty business. You're not suggesting old Bloodstone had a hand in it? Not necessarily. But someone used his crest. That takes either theft or access. Have you supplied any seal stamps of that family recently? Sprott looked offended. Certainly not. I sell heraldic reproductions, not forgeries. But someone could have bought one. Not without my knowing, he said firmly. They're rare, and I don't keep them out on the counter like sweetmeats. I did, however, have one engraved for a collector last year. He wished to match the Bloodstone line exactly, kept going on about how the owl must face west and not east. And the name of this discriminating customer? Sprott hesitated. He gave his name as Mr. Wickham, paid in cash. That sort, nervous, particular. Wore gloves indoors. Whimsy's eyes narrowed slightly. Wickham, interesting. Did he collect other items? Only one thing stands out. He bought a chapel floor plan from the 18th century. The original layout of Crowthorne's chapel, as it happens, said he was doing a paper on rural ecclesiastical geometry. Frankly, I thought he was odd. Could you describe him? Tallish, narrow build, spectacles. Spoke quietly. Accent was hard to place. Educated but unanchored. Whimsy and Parker exchanged a glance. Could it have been a woman? Parker asked. Sprott looked startled. A woman, possibly. Wore a long coat. The sort of person you'd ignore on a train. Thank you, said Whimsy. You've been most illuminating. Would you mind making a sketch of the individual? Even a poor one might be helpful. As they left the shop, Whimsy paused by the rusting water pump at the corner and gazed toward the silhouette of Crowthorne Hall, its turrets just visible through the mist. Miss Severn, he said at last, advised Hargrave on the chapel's design, corresponded before he bought the place. And now it seems someone, quite possibly her, obtained a forged seal and a copy of the chapel's floor plan. That's an uncomfortable triangle, Parker said. She could have written the letter. She had the motive, resentment, possessiveness. She cultivated his obsession with the hall. And she may well have orchestrated his death to resemble a prophecy fulfilled. The third owner driven out. But why so elaborate? Because it isn't about murder, Charles, said Whimsy softly. It's about message. Someone is trying to punish men like Hargrave for treating Crowthorne as a hobby, turning the estate into a stage where they can perform their wealth. She's dismantling the illusion, one owner at a time. You think the previous incidents were her work too? I think we'd be naive to imagine that Hargrave's death is the beginning. It's the culmination. The others were driven away, one by financial ruin, the other by madness. Each method more refined than the last. And now we've got death by Gothic punctuation. Parker exhaled. So what next? Next we speak with the one person who may have seen the ghost come calling. Wells. Back at Crowthorne, they found the gardener kneeling in the damp soil near the greenhouse, pruning the rose bushes with delicate fury. He straightened at their approach and dusted his hands on his trousers. Something else, my lord. You said you saw a figure moving near the house that evening. Have you remembered anything further? Wells looked uncomfortable. Didn't like to say, sir. But I thought I saw them again, later. When? Must have been near midnight. I woke sudden-like. Old dog barking. Looked out the shed window and saw a shadow in the chapel yard, standing still under the arch. Could you make out the face? No, sir. Just a coat dark, but the way they stood. Still as the stone saints. Like they were listening. Listening to what? The ground, maybe. Or waiting, Parker asked. Could it have been Miss Seven? Couldn't say. But I don't think it was Mr. Hargrave. Too rigid, Whimsy nodded slowly. That's enough for now. Thank you. As they turned back toward the house, Parker said, If it was her, why go to the chapel after the murder? The chapel after the murder. Because the act wasn't complete until witnessed by the dead, Whimsy said. The chapel has always been at the center of this. Hargrave's letters, the floor plans, the legacy of the land. Miss Seven wanted more than vengeance. She wanted ritual. That afternoon, Whimsy requested Miss Seven join him in the library. She arrived with the composed stillness of a woman entering an old confession box. Bunter brought tea. Whimsy did not touch it. I wanted to ask you about Mr. Wickham. She did not blink. Your name in the antiquarian's ledger, Whimsy said. Used to purchase a replica of the Bloodstone seal. And a chapel plan. Quite the theatrical preparation. She was silent. You misled Hargrave, he continued gently. You stoked his fears. You told him the estate was watching him. You sent him the letter. You cleaned the balustrade. Her hands trembled barely. I had no choice, she said. There's always choice. He was going to build a conservatory, she whispered. Over the chapel graves. Said they'd make splendid drainage. He didn't see the place. Not the way we do. We? All of us. The villagers, the ones who remember. Bloodstone forgot too, in his way. But at least he knew to leave things buried. Hargrave. He thought money bought absolution. That he could prune the past and replant it. You killed him to preserve a memory? She looked up. I arranged a lesson. I left the letter. Told him the house had chosen. He thought it was madness. But then madness listens more closely. When I came to the chapel, I knew he'd gone through with it. You didn't put the rope around his neck? No, but I chose the window. I opened the door. Parker's voice was cold. You'll be charged, Miss Seven. Even suggestion can be sufficient for guilt. I know, she said. I've waited. As she rose and left the room in silence, Whimsy stared out the same Gothic window where Hargrave had hung. The oaks beyond the chapel stood still in the windless dusk. Guardians of something older than law and untouched by modern hands. I'm not sure whether that was murder, said Parker quietly. Nor am I, said Whimsy. But it was something far more English. A protest. And then he lit a cigarette, not for comfort, but to mark the moment. Because in places like Crowthorne, memory was the true inheritance, and some ghosts simply wore better clothes. By the following morning, the wind had risen in earnest, snapping through the trees with an authority that suggested the weather itself disapproved of Crowthorne Hall's recent theatrics. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, was untroubled by Gales having spent the better part of his breakfast making careful notes on an envelope and buttering toast with the same pen-stained fingers. The clatter of crockery in the hall's breakfast room served as a mundane counterpoint to the quiet disquiet rising around them. Across the table, Parker sat with a mug of aggressively black coffee and the sort of frown that suggested mental arithmetic of the moral kind. So, he said finally, we've got her statement. She admits to sending the forged letter, to fanning Hargrave's fears, to leading him toward the scene. But she swears she didn't lay a hand on him. Indeed, said Whimsy, scribbling something that looked like a cryptic crossword but wasn't. And you believe her? I don't know. It's difficult to see where the boundary lies, between coercion and conspiracy. If she frightened him into suicide, is that murder? It depends, said Whimsy, nibbling his toast, on whether she intended it. The law is awfully fond of intention, Charles. Intention is what separates a sinister joke from a criminal act. Also politicians from lunatics, but she did mean to unsettle him. Oh yes, but unsettling is not illegal. If it were, half the clergy would be behind bars. The trouble lies in the theatre of it all. The letter, the cleaned banister, the eerie silence. It's less crime of passion, more crime of cues. She orchestrated a death scene and waited for her player to perform. Parker rubbed his temple. And the player performed. Do we know whether Hargrave had ever attempted suicide before? No, said Whimsy. But we do know he was suggestible. Illness, inherited melancholy, spiritual dabblings. His file reads like a case study in quiet desperation, which makes her manipulation all the more vicious. Perhaps, Whimsy mused. But remember, she didn't push him. She opened the door. He stepped through it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bunter, immaculate as ever, bearing a tray with the day's post. Whimsy took it absently, flipping through bills and circulars, until his fingers paused on a plain white envelope, postmarked Gallows Cross, but with no return address. He opened it. A single typewritten line stared up at him. You've looked in all the wrong places. Ask about the will. He handed it across the table to Parker, who read it twice, frowned, and said, Anonymous? Quite. A melodramatic flourish, too, but useful. A reminder, perhaps, that not all mysteries are solved with spectral theatrics. Some, dear Charles, come down to ink and probate. 10 minutes later, they were standing in what passed for Hargrave's study once again, this time joined by Mr. Adrian Tyers, solicitor to the Hargrave estate, and a man with spectacles so thick they magnified his indecision. I wasn't aware Lord Peter was involved formally, Tyers said, clutching a briefcase like a reliquary. Neither am I, said Whimsy pleasantly, but I've always admired a good will. Nothing more revealing, you know. People write them with such exquisite hope and loathing. Tyers cleared his throat. Yes, well, Mr. Hargrave's testament was rather short. He left the bulk of his estate to Miss Seven. There was a pause. All of it? Asked Parker. Almost. Some small bequests to distant cousins. A few thousand to the gardener, Mr. Wells. But the hall, the furnishings, and the liquid assets, yes. All to Miss Seven. Whimsy tapped the edge of the desk. And was this a recent revision? 6 weeks ago. Executed in my presence. Was he of sound mind? Tyers looked startled. Certainly. Melancholy, perhaps, but lucid. He spoke of gratitude, of Miss Seven's companionship. Said she had given the whole purpose again. Did he mention any concerns? About enemies, curses, things that go bump in the architectural night? Tyers coughed. He was poetic. Said he felt the hall disliked him. But I assume that was metaphor. These old places can weigh on a man. Whimsy rose slowly. And no one else contested the will? Not as yet. The cousins barely knew him. And Miss Seven, well, she hasn't even opened the hall's accounts since the death. She said it didn't feel appropriate. Parker looked up. You believe she's sincere? Tyers blinked. Frankly, I don't know, but she never struck me as mercenary. If anything, she seemed tethered here, like she belonged to the hall more than the man who owned it. As the solicitor departed, Whimsy stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Well, he said softly, that alters the portrait. You think she killed for the inheritance? Possibly. Or perhaps not for money, but for possession. Miss Seven seems like the sort of person for whom ownership is emotional, not financial. She resented the parade of owners, each trampling what she saw as sacred. Perhaps this was her way of reclaiming the hall by removing the temporary tenants. But inheritance gives her motive. But motive isn't the same as method. If she drove him to suicide, the will is merely a consequence. If she killed him, well, then it's something altogether different. And I don't believe she tied the knot. She may have played Mephistopheles, but I sense another hand in the final act. That afternoon, Whimsy requested a quiet word with Wells, the gardener, who met them again by the orchard wall. There was something more composed in his posture now, as though events had clarified a long-standing unease. Wells, Whimsy said, did Mr. Hargrave ever speak to you about his will? Once, sir. Said he wanted the hall to stay with someone who understood its bones. Thought Miss Seven did. Did he ever seem frightened of her? No, sir. Not frightened. But he relied on her. Too much, maybe. Like he didn't trust his own mind. And you? Did you trust her? Wells hesitated. I think she loved the place more than anything. Don't know if that's good or bad. Whimsy nodded slowly. Thank you. As the day closed in and the long Dorset dusk cast the house in uncertain silhouette, Whimsy sat once more in the library, turning over thoughts like coins. Parker entered, jacket off, sleeves rolled. You're not sleeping. Sleeping is for people without unresolved endings, Whimsy replied. I spoke with the coroner. Preliminary examination shows bruising on the left shoulder. Could be consistent with a fall, or with someone helping him to the banister. So, Whimsy murmured, he may not have hung himself at all. Exactly. And if that's true, then Miss Seven's implication becomes darker. She didn't just prod him, she may have collaborated. Or she was manipulated herself. Parker frowned. By whom? Whimsy rose. By someone who stood to gain from both her loyalty and his death. Someone overlooked, someone trusted, someone who cleaned boots and fetched letters and knew the layout of the hall better than its owner ever did. Parker stared. You mean Bates? Whimsy smiled faintly. Let's say we wake early tomorrow, Charles. I'd like to have a word with the man who served both Blodstone and Hargrave, and may, in his own quiet way, have served the hall itself. The clock struck 11. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked with the sound of remembered footsteps, and Lord Peter Whimsy, his eyes narrowing with thought, listened to it not as a sound, but as a suggestion. Bates was already awake when Lord Peter Whimsy entered the pantry the following morning, accompanied by the unruffled Parker and a silence of particular weight. The old servant stood precisely as one imagined he always did, jacket immaculate, expression dryly neutral, and hands folded with the discretion of a Victorian gravestone. Good morning, Bates, Whimsy said, selecting a chair that looked unlikely to collapse under aristocratic scrutiny. I trust the tea is strong and the conscience stronger? Bates gave the faintest of inclinations. Your lordship prefers lapsang. I've arranged for it. Always a man of foresight, Whimsy murmured. And since we are already so attuned in our sympathies, perhaps you'd indulge me in a little chat. Informal, of course, between gentlemen who appreciate correct cutlery. Bates inclined again, though his shoulders stiffened like the starch in his collar. We've been puzzling over Mr. Hargrave's unfortunate demise, Whimsy continued. So curious, the positioning of the body. Hand the knot. Too neat for an amateur, wouldn't you agree? I couldn't say, my lord. I was not present. But you were in the house, Parker said flatly, and you served Mr. Hargrave for nearly 6 months. You knew his moods, his habits. I did. You also served Mr. Blodstone, and before him his cousin. That's a rather long history at Crowthorne, Bates, longer than most. Yes, sir. Whimsy leaned forward slightly. You've seen owners come and go. Some with money, some with delusions. Tell me, did any of them belong to the hall? Bates's face did not change, but a pause bloomed, where a reply ought to have been. No, my lord, he said at last. They did not. And yet Miss Seven, she did. I do not comment on other members of the household. Except, Whimsy said softly, when it suits your purposes. We believe Mr. Hargrave was not alone when he died. The bruise on his shoulder, for instance, could be from a fall or from someone helping him. Upwards. Still, Bates said nothing. We also know, Parker said, that Miss Seven forged the letter. She steered Mr. Hargrave toward fear. But she insists she didn't touch him. She didn't, Bates said quietly. Whimsy lifted an eyebrow. Ah, and how would you know that unless... Because I was there. A silence fell in the pantry like a dropped fork in a cathedral. I found him, Bates went on, in the library. He had the rope. He was trembling, pale. I asked if I should fetch Miss Seven. He shook his head, said it was already done. And what did you do? Parker asked, voice clipped. I tried to talk him down. He wouldn't listen. He said the hall had rejected him, that he was only the final act in a tragedy older than himself. I told him he was ill, that he'd feel differently in the morning. Whimsy watched him with the quiet attention of a chess master studying an endgame. He climbed the stairs, Bates said, slowly, and then he stood there, shaking. I thought he wouldn't do it. He looked at me. And then he slipped. His foot went. He hit the rail. The rope was already tied. It caught. So it was an accident, Parker murmured. No, Bates said firmly. It wasn't an accident. It was a scene. And I let it happen. Why? Whimsy asked. Bates met his gaze. Because I believed the house had chosen. Because Miss Seven believed. Because Mr. Hargrave had treated this place like a stage set. Because I was tired of watching history sold off to men who mistook inheritance for possession. Whimsy's voice was low. You helped him die. I watched him die. There's a difference. But I knew what would happen. And I did nothing to stop it, even though you could have. Yes. Whimsy was silent for a long moment. Then he stood brushing a speck of lint from his sleeve. Mr. Bates, he said, you've served this house faithfully, but you've confused stewardship with judgment. That is a dangerous thing. I know, my lord. You'll give your statement to Inspector Parker. In full, I will. Later, in the library, Whimsy stood at the window again, watching the bare branches twist against the grey. Parker joined him, a cigarette between his fingers. So that's it, then. She broke his mind. He staged his own death. And Bates stood by. Yes, Whimsy said. A murder committed in 3 acts, with no blood, no fingerprints, no weapon. Only belief. Miss Seven lit the fuse. Hargrave struck the match. Bates watched it burn. And the law? Whimsy sighed. We'll charge them both. Accessory before and during. Perhaps some clever barrister will argue diminished capacity. Perhaps the jury will see a man undone by superstition and not by malice. Parker exhaled. I wonder if he'd still be alive if he'd bought a house in Surrey. Possibly. But even in Surrey he might have met someone like Miss Seven. And every house has ghosts. It's only a question of how loudly they speak. That evening the hall grew still again. Bunter packed the final suitcases. Whimsy lingered a moment longer in the drawing room, beneath the faded portrait of an 18th century dowager, with the kind of glare that withered grandchildren into obedience. You know, Bunter, he said, Crowthorne is not cursed. It's merely heavy with history. And history, if left untended, grows teeth. Yes, my lord. And yet, Whimsy continued, I rather think Miss Seven will be buried here, some day, whether in the chapel or in local memory. She became part of the hall in a way Hargrave never did. Quite, my lord. As they stepped out into the wind, the old oak trees creaked gently overhead. The hall loomed behind them, grim, unyielding, and perhaps for the first time in many years empty. Do you believe the dead watch us, Bunter? Bunter considered. I believe the living often behave as though they do, my lord. Whimsy smiled faintly. Quite right. And perhaps that's the truest ghost story of all. He tipped his hat to the silent house, turned on his heel, and walked away without once looking back. The village of Gallows Cross had returned to its habitual state of damp quiet, as though the events at Crowthorne Hall had been swallowed into the soil like last season's rain. But the ripples remained. In the snug of the wren and partridge, voices dropped when the hall was mentioned. The postmistress now passed letters with a nervous glance, and the vicar was said to have adjusted his next sermon to include an extended metaphor on pride, stewardship, and the inescapable echo of stone walls. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, was not yet done with echoes. Back in London, seated in the sedate gloom of his Piccadilly drawing-room, he stared at the final page of Miss Seven's confession, such as it was. It had arrived by hand, delivered by a junior solicitor from Tyer's firm, and tied not with the expected red tape of legal formality, but with a slender black ribbon. It wasn't a full confession in the criminal sense. Rather, it was a sort of personal apologia, a quiet, unsparing portrait of a woman who had slowly entwined herself with a place until she no longer knew where its thresholds ended, and her conscience began. He would not listen. I offered him rituals, candles, silence, the names of the dead. I offered him history. He wanted possession. That was the difference. He mistook reverence for ownership, and in the end, I think he knew. He gave himself over to the house because it refused to yield to him. Whimsy folded the letter and leaned back, fingers steepled. History as punishment, he murmured, and devotion as design. Parker always did say murder's more philosophy than action. He did not quite believe she had intended to kill, not in the blunt prosecutable sense. But he did believe she had prepared the stage too well, left too many openings, told too many stories that frayed a man's nerves like unraveled thread. And most damning of all, she had watched. Still, it was Bates who had seen the end, who had stood at the top of the stairs and chosen inaction. Whimsy stood restive and moved to the window. Outside, a taxi curved neatly through the mist. A girl in a green hat hesitated at the crossing. A newspaper vendor shouted something about coal strikes and scandal in the colonies, and somewhere in Dorset, the hall stood, shuttered once more. Silent again, he returned to the desk. Spread across the leather blotter were 3 items: the copy of Hargrave's will, the floor plan of the chapel purchased under a false name, and a second envelope, thicker, unsealed, bearing no markings at all. This last had been found in Bates's quarters after his formal statement. It contained a letter, not addressed to anyone, nor signed, but written in the same tight, regular hand as the menu notes he had left each morning on Hargrave's breakfast tray. I watched 2 men die in that house, one from bankruptcy of spirit, the other from overdraft of the soul. I cleaned their boots. I laid their fires. I listened to their silences. And I came to believe the house knew that it wished for rest, not spectacle. I did not raise a hand, but I did not raise a voice either. Whimsy sighed. A butler's confession is always more literary than legal. So much restraint, so much civility. He wondered briefly what the jury would make of it. Would they see an accomplice, or a man too devoted to tradition, too polite to prevent tragedy? Parker had called from Scotland Yard that morning. She'll likely be found unfit, he'd said. Psychological damage. A history of emotional trauma after the war. The doctors say she's been living through symbols. Bates will face manslaughter charges, but it'll be difficult to prove complicity. No evidence he helped. Just that he didn't stop it. And the estate, Whimsy had asked, transferred to a legal trust. Bloodstone's firm is circling like crows. There's talk of turning it into a heritage site, or a retreat for troubled artists. Whimsy had groaned at that. Oh, Lord, the only thing worse than a haunted house is a house full of poets. Now, with the letter folded before him, and London's winter pressing against the panes, he lit a cigarette and stared at the ceiling. There had been no villain in this story. No convenient monster with a motive and a blunt object. Just the slow erosion of reason under the pressure of memory. Crowthorne Hall, he thought, had absorbed its owners like damp through plaster. Not maliciously, but with a kind of weary inevitability. It had no need to murder. It merely waited. He had seen houses like that before. Old country seats with stone bones and family guilt seeping up from the cellars. They didn't curse their owners, they reflected them. Amplified whatever was brittle or hollow or unresolved. In Hargrave, it had found a man already afraid of meaninglessness. In Miss Seven, a woman who wished to believe in legacy more than law. And in Bates, a man too weary to stop the past from playing out again. There was a knock at the door. Bunter, of course, with a tray and the Evening Post. Letters, my lord. One from Inspector Parker, and a package from Dorset. Whimsy raised a brow. From the Hall? From Mr. Tyer's clerk. Contained within are several books recovered from Mr. Hargrave's study. One was marked for your attention. Bunter handed him a thin, cloth-bound volume. A guide to medieval funerary rites, inscribed on the flyleaf in Hargrave's hand. For those who believe the dead should be remembered, not reburied. Touching, Whimsy murmured, turning the pages. He wanted to understand. In the end, he merely fled. He set the book down and reached for Parker's letter. It was short, written in the detective's usual no-nonsense tone. We've closed the file. Official cause. Suicide with contributing psychological manipulation. No further charges expected. The coroner's note reads like a Greek chorus. Death by inheritance of memory. Rather poetic for an official document. You've a reputation to blame for that, I'm afraid. Whimsy chuckled softly. Then, setting everything aside, he walked to the fireplace and stood there for a long time, warming his hands. His eyes were distant, thoughtful. Bunter cleared his throat. If I may ask, my lord, do you think it will happen again? What? The Hall turning on another? Yes, my lord. Whimsy didn't answer for a moment. Then, no, not soon. I believe it has had its fill for now. 3 acts, 3 owners, a complete performance. Like a Greek tragedy, my lord? Whimsy smiled. Yes, Bunter, except in this one, the gods never needed to appear. The mortals ruined themselves quite adequately. He turned back toward the fire. Still, I wonder, he said quietly, what would have happened if Hargrave had simply left? Packed his bags, sold the Hall to a boarding school or a tobacco heiress. What Miss Seven would have done with an audience that refused the script? Perhaps, Bunter said, the tragedy was only possible because he believed in it. Whimsy nodded. Quite so. The most dangerous stories are the ones we tell ourselves. And then, with nothing more to say and everything resolved in the most English manner possible, through silence, decorum, and a decided lack of melodrama. He poured himself a glass of claret and resumed his book. Outside, London went about its business, entirely unaware that somewhere deep in the Dorset countryside, a house had decided for now not to speak again. The weeks that followed unfolded with the quiet relentlessness of a countryside winter. Frost lacquered the hedgerows around Gallows Cross, and the stone lions flanking the gates of Crowthorne Hall wore crowns of rime. The villagers, who had grown adept over generations at burying their unease beneath routine, spoke less and less of Hargrave's death. Silence in a place like this had the dignity of tradition, but for Lord Peter Wimsey, the silence was not yet complete. In the well-worn sanctuary of the London Library, beneath its hush of polished wood and reverent dust, he had begun assembling what he called, without irony, the footnotes to tragedy. Parker, more direct, had asked bluntly over lunch why he was still digging at a case the courts had already buried. Because, Wimsey replied, folding a linen napkin with surgical precision, something still jars. What does? The completeness of it, Wimsey said. 3 owners, 3 exits, all wrapped in a metaphor so tidy it could have been composed in Greek hexameter. And Miss Seven far too literary for reality. You'll notice she never once denied the inheritance. Never burned the will. She claimed she didn't want the estate, but she signed the deeds without hesitation. Parker frowned. You think she planned it all? No, said Wimsey. I think she invited it. But she didn't author the final act. Fates may have stood by, yes, but he's not the sort to engineer a Gothic drama. And Hargrave, well, he was many things, but cunning wasn't one of them. So who are you missing? Parker asked. Someone who stayed in the wings, Wimsey murmured, eyes distant. Not a killer, perhaps, but a director. Someone who understood the roles being played and adjusted the curtain when needed. That very afternoon a letter arrived from Blodstone, not in the sharp, officious hand of a legal correspondent, but with the looser scrawl of a man halfway to senility and no longer afraid of consequence. Wimsey read it once, then again, then rang for his coat. Blodstone received him in the study of the Dower House, dressed in a dressing gown and the same scowl he had worn like a badge during their first meeting. The room smelled of cigar ash and old paper, and a fire crackled in a grate that had been Gothicized by an overly ambitious stonemason in the 1850s. You received it then, Blodstone said. I wasn't sure you would come. I always respond to letters, Wimsey said lightly. It's the aristocratic form of self-preservation. He accepted the offered glass of sherry without comment and sat down. Blodstone stared into the fire for a long time. I wanted the Hall back, he said finally. Of course I did. The place was my family's for 4 generations. I sold it because I was told I must. Debts, taxes, the usual guillotine of progress, but I hated each buyer in turn. And Hargrave, he was the worst. A man with no spine and far too much money. He took the Hall and turned it into an echo chamber for his nerves. You were quite public in your disapproval, Wimsey observed. Indeed. But I didn't write the letter. And I didn't push him off the banister. No, said Wimsey. But I wonder if you didn't help someone else do so. Blodstone smiled faintly. 7. She needed no help. But someone gave her the language. Someone reminded her of the past. Someone whispered the myth until she believed it. Blodstone said nothing. You forged nothing, Wimsey continued, but you gave her access to the crest. She bought the seal under a false name, but it was you who told her the owl must face west. Only a Blodstone would know that. You told Sprott as much. I may have been indiscreet. You were manipulative, Wimsey said softly. You fed her narrative. You dressed the noose in metaphor. Blodstone turned his glass slowly between his fingers. I told her the Hall had memory, that it kept score, that it ejected the unworthy, and she believed you. She wanted to. And you? Wimsey asked. What did you want? Blodstone's face twitched. To prove I was right, that you can't sell a legacy without it costing someone. That cost was Hargrave's life. Blodstone shrugged. A man like that, he was already halfway gone. I didn't push, I merely let the current take him. Wimsey stood. You'll make no confession, of course. None that will matter. I didn't break the law, Lord Peter. I merely told a story. It isn't my fault someone believed it. But you chose your audience well, Wimsey said. And your stage. You've had your tragedy, Mr. Blodstone. Let's hope the curtain stays down. Back in London, Wimsey found himself strangely subdued. He wrote no report. He made no calls. He sat in the quiet of his flat with a book he did not open and a drink he did not finish. Because in the end there had been no criminal mastermind. No hidden poison, no secret passage. Just a slow weaving of belief and bitterness and silence. Bloodstone had not killed Hargrave, any more than Seven had tied the rope or Bates had summoned the storm. But together, they had told a story dark enough to live in. Parker arrived the next day, bringing with him the last of the files. The case was closed. The newspapers, which had briefly salivated over the Gothic angle, had moved on to a society scandal involving opera singers and foreign bonds. "I read the letter," Parker said. "Bloodstone won't talk again. His solicitors made sure of that." "He doesn't need to," Wimsey said. "His fingerprints aren't on the rope, they're on the page." He turned Crowthorne into a morality tale. "And the next buyer?" "There won't be one." "Not for a while. The estate's in trust. There's talk of offering it to the Historical Preservation Fund. They're very excited about the chapel." Parker gave him a long look. "So it's over." Wimsey considered. "No, it simply paused. What does that mean?" "It means stories like this don't end, Charles. They just go dormant, until the house speaks again and someone is listening." Parker was silent. Then he said, "Do you ever get tired of these things?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "Only of pretending not to understand them." He rose, and together they looked out at the mist rolling in from the Thames. No one would be punished. Not formally. The law had found what justice it could. But in a cold stone house in Dorset, a story still lived in the floors and timbers, waiting for someone new to misread it. And Lord Peter Wimsey, who had read it correctly, quietly hoped no one would turn the page. The following spring, Crowthorne Hall stood as it always had, immovable, brooding, untouched by the passing of headlines or the quiet retreat of scandal. Moss crept over the flagstones with renewed confidence, and the chapel bell, long disused, rang faintly in the wind one morning as if stirred by something other than weather. No new owner had arrived. The hall remained in the care of a trust that had yet to agree what to do with it. Meanwhile, the house waited, dust settling with deliberate patience. In London, Lord Peter Wimsey received a final letter. It was posted from an anonymous return address, postmarked Salisbury, and bore the same narrow, angular script as the letter Miss Seven had once left in the hearth, delicate, precise and full of unspoken ritual. "Lord Peter, you once asked me whether I believed the house spoke. I do not, but I believe we can teach it what to say. Every inhabitant adds a word, a gesture, a silence. Mr. Hargrave gave it fear. I gave it memory. Mr. Bloodstone gave it pride. If someone ever teaches it mercy, the hall may sleep at last. You may publish that if you wish, or bury it. There are different kinds of graves." E.S. Wimsey read the note twice, then placed it beside the others in the drawer of his writing desk marked, "Not yet for the memoirs." He sat for a long moment before rising to retrieve a volume from the shelf. Greek Tragedy and the English Country House, a curious little book he had bought years ago and never opened. He opened it now to a chapter titled "Legacy as Curse," read half a paragraph, and shut it again with a faint laugh. "Too easy," he muttered, and turned instead to his diary. That same day, a letter arrived from Parker. No further action to be taken regarding Miss Seven. Psychological evaluation deemed her emotionally influenced but not mentally unstable. Her statement remains part of the sealed file. Bates has been quietly dismissed from service. No charges pursued. He's gone to live with a niece in Devon. Claims to be done with old houses. I doubt it. Bloodstone has retreated to obscurity. Still delivers letters to historical journals no one reads. The trustees have placed iron locks on the hall, but someone always leaves flowers by the chapel door. Every Sunday morning. No one's been seen doing it. That, too, is a kind of confession, I suppose. Thought you'd want to know. Wimsey smiled faintly. He had, in fact, wanted to know. More than that, he wanted the story to settle, like ash in a grate, warm but undisturbed. And yet there were still embers to consider. He took a walk that afternoon across Green Park and into St. James's, letting the bustle and spring air clear the lingering scent of stone and gilt. It was difficult to leave behind cases like Crowthorne, not because they were unsolved, but because they were too thoroughly understood. There was no triumph in them. Only the precise architecture of failure, each choice, each silence, each misjudged kindness, slotting neatly into place until nothing else could have happened. Somewhere near the Reform Club, he was hailed by a familiar voice. It was Mr. Sprott, the antiquarian, clutching a parcel and looking vaguely damp, as if history had rained on him. "Lord Peter," he said, breathless. "Thought you might want this." Found among the odds. It was part of a private donation. From a Miss S., no full name. "I thought it..." Apt. The parcel was wrapped in brown paper and string. Wimsey accepted it with polite curiosity and unwrapped it later in his drawing room. Inside was a small hand-inked map, an architectural rendering of the chapel at Crowthorne, in the form it had taken during the 17th century, before Victorian tastes had Gothicized it beyond recognition. It bore a single addition, not found in any of the other versions he'd seen, a circled alcove at the rear of the nave, annotated in elegant script. Here stood the memorial stone to Margaret Severn, died 1642, reinterred without marker. Wimsey stared, then laughed, not out of amusement, but out of a dawning comprehension. "So that's it," he murmured. She was one of them. The Severn family, long ago lapsed into obscurity, had once been part of the landowning tapestry around Crowthorne. That Miss Eugenia Severn had returned, under pretext or pilgrimage, was no longer merely eccentric. It was ancestral. He remembered her words during their first interview. He felt the hall had memory. I believe he was quite wrong, but she hadn't believed that at all. She had known it better than anyone. She had simply been protecting its memory, and perhaps her own. Bunter entered, bearing a tray. "Post again, my lord?" "No," Wimsey said, setting the map gently aside. "No more post. Just shadows made solid. Indeed, my lord. Later that week he returned once more to Dorset, discreetly, without Parker, or newspapers or solicitors. He stood again before the gate of the hall, locked and flanked with rust, and looked up at the windows where no faces watched. He made no attempt to enter. Instead, he walked around to the chapel, still roofed in lead and silence. The ironwork of the door resisted him, but not stubbornly. The inside was as it had always been, cool, musty, and steeped in the quiet despair of English stone. And there, in the alcove she had marked, he found what he had half hoped, half dreaded: a small spray of rosemary bound with black ribbon, and a slip of paper weighted with a pebble. "Remember me not as I was, but as I would have been remembered." He left no reply. Just a single white rose from a florist in St. James's, placed carefully beside the rosemary, and the knowledge that memory, like architecture, often outlives intention. Back in London he dined with Parker and reported none of it. Some stories he had come to believe were best left unread, at least aloud. But when asked what he made of it all, he offered a single line, spoken over the clink of wine glasses and the clatter of closing kitchens. "It was a murder," he said, "but not of a man. It was the killing of a house's innocence. And what took its place?" Parker asked. Wimsey raised his glass. "Legacy," he said, "and the kind of silence that says, 'We will not forget, but we also will not speak.'" And so the case of Crowthorne Hall passed into memory, not as a tale of villainy or proof of guilt, but as an architecture of sorrow, too refined for punishment, too intricate for peace. Lord Peter Wimsey never returned to the hall again. But now and then, when a particular silence fell over his books, he would think of its chapel, and the woman who believed the past should be remembered but not inherited. And in that, perhaps she had finally been right. Lord Peter Wimsey rarely gave public lectures. He considered the act of expounding knowledge in a hall of strangers to be a form of theatrical immodesty, like stripping for a cold audience, he once quipped. But when the invitation came from the Society for Architectural Symbolism and Historical Psychology, a body so arcane it barely remembered its own initials, he accepted without hesitation. His lecture, titled "The Memory of Stone, Inheritance and Identity in English Country Houses," was held at the Royal Institute, in a room that smelled faintly of ink, chalk and egos preserved in glass cases. The audience, scholars, archivists, and the occasional fellow of indeterminate allegiance, sat politely, notebooks poised. He began with Crowthorne Hall. He spoke, not of murder, but of meaning, of the way a house passed from hand to hand, absorbs the fears and desires of its inhabitants. He described Mr. Hargrave's transformation from curious restorer to paranoid recluse, quoting excerpts from the journal found in his study. "The chapel speaks without sound. I hear disapproval in the grain of the walls." He noted Miss Severn's curious consistency, her connection to the hall long predating Hargrave's ownership, her architectural guidance offered under the guise of friendship, and her deep, almost religious reverence for the building's original integrity. He spoke of the forged letter, the owl seal mimicking Blodstone's hand, and the scene Hargrave walked into believing it had been fated. But the turning point, Whimsy said, was not in the act itself but in the permission given. Bates, he said, voice low and deliberate, was not a killer, but he was an archivist of failure, a man who had lived too long with endings and come to think them sacred. He believed the hall chose, that his inaction was reverence. But when you allow myth to direct your conscience, you are no longer a servant of memory. You are its executioner. A stir in the audience, he continued, threading together the silent approval of Blodstone, who had stoked the flames of symbolism for spite, with Miss Severn's tragic longing for continuity. She had not forged the hall's doom. She had merely ensured no one escaped the script it whispered. She believed herself a steward, Whimsy said, but stewardship without clarity becomes possession, and possession is the first lie a house tells. He ended not with a flourish but with a quote, not from Blackstone or Cicero, but from Hargrave himself. "If the hall had eyes, it would weep. But because it has walls, it remembers." There was a long pause before the room stirred into applause, not loud, but respectful, the kind given to an unsettling truth elegantly delivered. Afterwards, Parker joined him at the back of the room. "You made it sound like a ghost story," he said. "It was," Whimsy replied, "in all but the ghost." Parker nodded. "And the conclusion?" Whimsy slipped a hand into his pocket, drew out a small envelope and handed it over. "7," he said. "Sent last week. She's gone. No forwarding address. Only this note." Parker opened it. "Tell Lord Peter the hall has stopped speaking to me. I believe that is forgiveness, or something like it." The note was unsigned, but it did not need to be. They stepped outside into the evening air. The sky was clearing, and a crescent moon sat low over the rooftops. "I've always wondered," Parker said, "what you'd have done if you'd inherited a place like Crowthorne." "I'd have sold it at a shocking discount and left a gramophone playing madrigals in the parlor to scare the surveyors," Whimsy said cheerfully. "And if it came back to you," he looked up at the sky, "then I'd make peace with its memory and hope it forgets mine." They parted ways at Piccadilly. Whimsy walked slowly, hat low, hands in pockets, not in mourning but in thought. Crowthorne Hall would not appear again in the newspapers. It would not open to tourists or historians. It would stand as it always had, waiting to be understood. But the story of its three owners, their exits, and the careful silences left behind had ended, not with punishment, not with glory, but with a lesson etched in stone about the cost of forgetting that a house, even an English one, can be made to believe the wrong thing if its inhabitants are careless with truth. And so Lord Peter Whimsy, the man who had read that truth through layers of metaphor and memory, walked on humming faintly to himself, not a hymn, not a requiem, but a refrain from an old folk ballad about love lost in ruins.